Next, the kelps. This is the great order Laminariales, brown algae, and this is a classic exemplar for us on this coast, as well as Macrocystis, the bull kelp. And I just want to tip my hat to Charles Darwin. I think many of you may have seen this quote or only part of it, but the beds of Macrocystis, he was in Chile, and he was Charles Darwin. Even when not of great breadth, make excellent natural floating breakwaters. It's quite curious to see in an exposed harbor how soon the waves from the open sea, as they travel through the straggling stems, sink in height and pass into smooth water. The number of living creatures of all orders whose existence intimately depends on the kelp is wonderful. A great volume might be written describing the inhabitants of one of these beds of seaweed. I can only compare these great aquatic forests of the southern hemisphere with terrestrial ones in the intertropical regions. Yet, if in any country a forest was destroyed, I do not believe nearly so many species of animals would perish as would here from the destruction of the kelp. Amidst the leaves of this plant, numerous species of fish live, which nowhere else could find food or shelter. With their destruction, the many cormorants, fishing birds, otters, seals, porpoises would soon perish. So what he's describing is an ecosystem engineer in beautiful language. So we took a look at these intertidal kelps, and that's what I want to look at now a little more closely, because these are fantastic organisms, and many of them are native to California. They evolved in the North Pacific from the Alaska all the way down. Species change, but kelps are dominant parts of our nearshore ocean. Alaria. Alaria is so easy to identify because of this prominent midrib on its blade. Long linear blades, slightly ruffled with that midrib. Near the base of the plant, here's the holdfast, just growing on a young one. You can see how these fingers are gluing themselves to the rock to support this large body. And here's where the holdfast would be, and here's the stipe. And along the stipe is cylindrical at the base and flattens out, and then initiates these lateral blades, which are reproductive. Here's a single lateral blade, and you can see this dark sorus or patch filled with spores. So each one of these blades, when the plant is mature, makes a sorus of spores that are released from this plant. This is a diploid sporophyte. So this is a diploid plant. Meiosis takes place in this tissue to form haploid zoospores in astronomical numbers. So Alaria marginata, midrib, long, wonderful blades, pendant from the rocks or flowing in the surge channels. Beautiful plant. Alaria, winged. Another very common one that you're almost bound to see. It's one of the highest kelps that occurs higher in the intertidal. It has long fronds with flat or sometimes thread-like lateral blades, and then floats to keep these blades buoyant in the water, to keep them from dragging on the substrate all the time and wearing away. They're buoyant in the water. And look at the holdfast. It starts with these little fingers, and this is a perennial plant. And over time, those fingers grow and smooth into these wonderful woody holdfasts. You can see a few of the fingers at the base clinging to the rock. So very distinctive blades, floats, holdfasts. And look at the juveniles. This is juvenile Egregia. It looks a lot like lasagna, ruffled, and in this portion here is where that midrib will grow. The main rib down the center will develop. All the growth happens at the base of this plant, and these will transform into this. So the ontogeny of the kelps, they all start out looking fairly similar, but their ontogeny, their development, gives them these diverse shapes. Egregia menzesii, named after Menzies. Laminaria secellii, named after Secel. Gorgeous plant. Hold fast deep in the weed here. Cylindrical at the base and then flattening into a broad divided blade. A palmate finger-like blade. Here it is again. Cylindrical, flattening into these gorgeous, flat, smooth, slimy, wonderful blades, segmented. And here is, this is a perennial kelp. Here is one in the springtime. The holdfasts have held fast. The stipes are still there. The blades have been whipped and torn and tattered, but here they are regenerating. And as they mature, they will start to split and look like this. Beautiful, beautiful plant. Laminaria secellii. Another laminaria, another stunner. This is Laminaria sinclairii, named after another phycologist. This one has big, broad holdfasts. See the little fingers here and the little fingers here? Big, broad holdfasts with many, many stipes, cylindrical stipes that at the very last minute flatten into long, linear, flat, smooth, narrow blades. So you see these great bundles of them and see how it's just dominating the rock? I see Egregia here. Here's with very narrow paddle-like blades. So there's Egregia, but then you go a little bit lower and Laminaria sinclairii dominates in this habitat, like sandy habitats. Many stipes from one holdfast and these narrow blades all clustered together. Beautiful. The California state seaweed, perhaps, Postelsia palmiformis. It would be better if it had a larger range. Comes from the north and it goes all the way down to Central California, but not Southern California. It's found in wave-swept shores. Look at all the endocladia growing on the mussels. Endocladia muricata, that little red rough weed. Here's Postelsia with these hollow stipes, big hollow stipes, and then this hairdo of blades with minute furrows in them. It's hard to see in the pictures, but the blades are not smooth. They're actually wrinkled with long linear furrows. This one reproduces on the blades and the spores drip down those furrows onto the ground beneath so that you get these aggregations. They compete with the mussels, but the mussels also help them out because the mussels often get ripped out by the waves, opening up space for young Postelsia to recruit into. So these two are intimately involved with each other, this animal and this seaweed. Pterygophora californica, another winged thing. Superficially, if you looked here, it looks a little like Alaria, but this isn't the base. Remember, Alaria has its reproductive blades at the base. This one has the reproductive blades coming off the side near the tip. So you see strong woody stipes. This is a perennial that makes this top knot of flat blades. When it's young, there's one initial blade that has a midrib, but this is soon deciduous, breaks off here. So you just have this top knot of lateral blades like this. And these blades, stipes, you often find washed up on the beach because they're so strong and woody. And they persist and they regenerate new blades in the spring, just like the laminarias do. So you see them gathered here together. Some of them have regenerated, some of them have not. And you can see these initial blades with the faint midrib. But here they've lost that initial blade and there they are. So let's take a look at the subtidal kelps that form the great kelp forests that are coast is famous for. Macrocystis pyrifera, incredible long-lived perennial. Here's a young holdfast. You can see the holdfast growing down onto the rocks. Throughout the life of the plant, it will continue to grow to sustain 50 or 60 feet of fronds with floats and blades like this, with little spines in the edge of the blades. And look how the blades are corrugated. There's a little spirorbid worm that forms calcareous little crusts, and they've landed in all the channels of the blade. The floats keep the thing buoyant to bring it up to the light. And here, a mature holdfast, and these lower blades are different. They're smooth. These are the sporophylls. These are the reproductive blades. So instead of bearing reproduction way at the top, just like Alaria, it bears reproduction blades near the base, so the spores can fall down and land on the ground and not have to go through the whole gamut of the column of seawater. So these are long-lived, but they reproduce copiously, are eaten by youngsters are eaten by urchins, but by and large, in good conditions, environmental conditions, the kelp forests are maintained. Incredible. This is what Darwin was talking about, Macrocystis pyrifera, which occurs both in the northern and southern hemisphere. Those floating plants, I think they get around in evolutionary history. Eisenia arborea, another kelp with a hollow, stiff stipe. But this one, the stipe divides into two Y-shaped division and then bears blades on each of them. So it was hard to see the Y shape here, so I put this one in so you can see how it divides in the Y shape. And look at the juvenile. Darling, cute. So this is really an understory species. It's very common in the understory of the Macrocystis forest. It's a southern species. And it will form spores on its blades. It never gets all that tall, maybe a meter tall. One of my best friends, Pelagophycus pora, first species I did any molecular work with, and just a all-around charismatic mega weed. Pelagophycus grows in the deep water from 140 feet in very clear water. In El Nino years, when it's warmer, it tends, and the warm water moves down, it tends to sort of move up more shallowly. It gets confused where it is. The thermoclines are disturbed and it recruits up more shallowly. But interestingly, it too has a dichotomous antler-like gig on its great float. These floats can be almost as big as our heads. This is a huge plant. It can be 120 feet tall, coming from deep water up into the light and displaying these great broad blades in the light, though it's always sub 40 or 50 feet deep, comes from the deep water, except in the warm water islands where the thing tends to be short, have a smaller float, and sometimes that float can't even hold up these great leaves and they lie on the ground, but there's a completely different form. And we discovered that it's one species, but there's been genetic subdivision between these warm water populations and the cold water populations. So kelps are still actively evolving in response to their environment. This is a southern species, Southern California and Baja California, Mexico. But once you can see them wash ashore, but once you see one underwater, or you see your buddy go down the stipe like it's a fire pole, you'll never forget this seaweed. So how do these reproduce? And I think you're going to see that this is fairly somewhat familiar life history in a way. All the kelps I've shown you are sporophytes. All of them are diploid. So here's sort of a Laminaria kind of guy with a holdfast. Sorus of reproductive cells called zoospores. They're called zoospores because they swim. They're released from that sorus, swim away from the sporophyte, but not far, probably within meters of the sporophyte. Each one of these gillions will grow into a gametophyte. This is a heteromorphic life history. The two phases do not look alike. One is a kelp and one is a filament. Here's a male composed of a few filaments, and usually the females are just a few cells big, and they're growing on the bottom of the ocean. The female retains that egg on her. That egg is fertilized by the male gamete, which can swim and sniff and smell pheromones from that egg. So there's actual seeking the egg in this life history. I think that really promotes it. The zygote is formed on the female gametophyte and grows into a sporophyte. So the female gametophyte, the mother of this sporophyte, is somewhere between the toes because she retained the egg. The zygote was fertilized and grew into the sporophyte. So that's an interesting little twist on egg retention. We have two free-living phases, but they do not look the same. The sporophyte is foliose and the gametophyte is filamentous. Who knew? This life history is really well known now, so that we can reproduce kelps by collecting sporophytes, releasing zoospores into water with ropes on it. Those zoospores settle on the rope and form gametophytes. We let those male and female gametophytes, male releases the gametes, finds the female. We take those ropes now covered with zygotes, put it out in the ocean, and we grow sporophytes to eat. We clever humans using this life history to make more, enough to eat and not to collect wild populations. Two free living phases that look different. So the species that grow beneath the kelps are incredibly diverse. That's, Darwin said it, and if you snorkel or dive underneath a kelp forest, you'll see this represents many species. This is Southern California, so we have this turfy bottom just filled with many species, very rich species richness. And you can see here too, here's Eisenia and understory species. One understory, I'm only going to talk about one kind of understory species because I don't want to forget to talk about the calcified red algae, the ones with calcium and magnesium carbonate in their cell walls. There are two great species that are endemic to the West Coast. They go up to up north and they go down south. They do not occur in Japan, we discovered, although it was once thought that they did. So this is Calliarthron, the beautiful joint, Chylosporioides, Calliarthron tuberculosum, bumpy. So tuberculosum tends to be sort of simpler segments of calcified segments joined together into these dichotomous fronds. Calcified segments with winged tips flattened in these calcified fronds. So these jointed plants can move with the water, yet they're hard and stony and the least favorite food of urchins, although the urchins will eat them if everything else is gone. The crustose species, this is an example of coralline red algae, are ubiquitous. Anywhere in the subtidal especially, but also the lower intertidal and the mid-intertidal, you will find crustose species. They don't like to be exposed to air, so they tend to be in pools in the intertidal, but they are ubiquitous in the subtidal. They are the species in the tropics that keep the coral reefs together, that glue them together. Crustose coral and red algae are ecologically extremely important and killer to identify. We're still working out what species we have in California using DNA and not morphology. Questions?